Hey everyone. So today we're going to do lecture 21, which is the last lecture. Well, lecture 22 I covered last week. So basically this week we are having the last class week, and then the next week we have the final exam. So this is your last lecture for this week. We should cover all the chapters in the book, and you should be ready for the final exam. So this lecture, the lecture 21, basically talks about monetary policy. Okay, so we did learn a little bit about monetary policy in our previous chapters, and it said, monetary policy basically deals with the control of money supply. When government is trying to control the money supply, one way they can do it is through the monetary policy. So it's a very broad topic, and we are going to cover a little bit about monetary policy in this chapter and give you an idea about how monetary policy works. So basically, the main objective of monetary policy is to promote a growing economy and create an employment as well as a stable environment. So just like a fiscal policy, we discussed about fiscal policy, the objectives of the monetary policy are the same. They want to create more employment, they want to bring about economic growth, and they want to create a stable environment. However, compared to a fiscal policy, the monetary policy basically implements or uses different tools. Their objectives are the same for fiscal policy and monetary policy, but they use different tools. And we saw, like, fiscal policy uses tools such as increasing or decreasing taxes, or increasing or decreasing government expenditures in order to control the economy, or in order to bring economic growth, or reduce inflation. Same way, monetary policy, we have different tools in which way we can control the money supply and thereby economic growth. And we're going to learn about those tools shortly. Okay, and basically the monetary policy is implemented by the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, or the central bank. Basically implements and controls the monetary policy. If you remember, fiscal policy was something that was going through the Congress and the president. On the other hand, Fed is something that is controlled by monetary policy is something that is controlled by the Fed, or the Federal Reserve. So what are the tools of the monetary policy? Basically, what mechanisms the monetary policy used to control the money supply? In broadly, there are two tools. Okay, so broadly, there are two tools to control the money supply, monetary policy, or tools. So monetary policy tools, and these tools are very important. You have to know these in terms of your questions for multiple choice questions, as well as problem sections. Okay, so there are two forms. One is known as major tools, the second one is called minor tools. Okay, these are two different ways we can control the money supply. Major tools basically affects directly affects the money supply. Minor tools basically has an indirect effect on money supply. Okay, so major tools have a significant and direct effect on money supply. Minor tools are basically indirect effect on money supply. Now, under each of these major tools and minor tools, we have categories. Basically, what are the major tools and what are the minor tools? So under major tools, we have three, and we're going to go over each, but now I wanted to give you a little bit, or I wanted to name those tools. The first one is the reserve requirement, and we learned about it last class when we talked about commercial banks. Remember, Fed requires all banks to keep reserve requirement, or to keep a certain amount of the deposit aside as reserve. That's reserve requirement. It's one of the major tools under monetary policy to control money supply. The second one is called discount rate, and we're going to go over these in details, but I just wanted to let you know what the major tools and minor tools are. And the third one are open market operations. Open market operations. Okay, so these are the three different major tools that we need to know: reserve requirement, discount rate, and open market operations. Okay, now what about the minor tools? The minor tools are basically known as margin requirement, and again we are going to go over these shortly. Margin requirement, That's the first type of minor tool. Second is called credit control, and third is called moral suasion. Moral suasion. Okay, so under monetary policy, we use tools to control the money supply. Now there can be two types of tools. Major tools have direct effect on the money supply, and these major tools are the reserve requirement, discount rate, and open market operations. There is another type of tool to control the money supply, which is called the minor tools. These have indirect effect on money supply, and the minor tools are basically the margin requirement, credit control, and moral suasion. Now basically we are going to discuss each of these in detail so you understand what each of these mean. So moving on to the next slide, the first major tool is called the reserve requirement. This is the most powerful tool to control the money supply. Remember this, reserve requirement is the most powerful tool to control the money supply. Basically, again, if you remember from last class, Fed requires, or Fed sets a minimum percentage that banks need to keep as reserves or on the side when we deposit money. Let's say, remember, when I deposit $100 in Wells Fargo today, then let's say Wells Fargo has a reserve requirement of 10%, then out of that $100 they have to keep $10 aside as reserves. That is because Fed is requiring them to do that. So when Fed is requiring them to put more money into the reserves, what does that mean? That means banks can loan less money to the people. When they loan less money to the people, that means people have less money supply in their hands, and as a result money supply decreases. On the other hand, if the Fed decreases this percentage or this reserve requirement, let's say from 10%, the Fed now makes it 5%. So what will happen when I deposit $100 now? If I deposit $100 now, Wells Fargo will only have to keep $5 aside as reserve, and then they can give out $95 as loan. So they can loan out more money. So reserve requirement is very important. It is a very important and powerful tool to control the money supply. If the Fed increases the reserve requirement, that means banks can loan out less money, which means the money supply decreases. The vice versa is also true. If the Fed decreases the reserve requirement, banks can loan out more money to the people. People will have more money in their hands and money supply will go up. Okay, so you know the reserve requirement of this percentage depends on the size of the banks and the type of deposits, you know, whether it's for a savings account or whether it's for a checking account, and also depends on the size of our bank, you know, if it's a small community bank or if it's a national large bank such as Wells Fargo or Bank of America. So not all banks will have the same reserve requirement. It will vary based on location, based on size, the type of deposits, a lot of factors, and Fed is ultimately the one deciding this percentage, and the main reason to do that is to control the money supply. Now the second tool the Fed uses to control the money supply, and this is one of the major tools, that is called discount rate. So what is discount rate? This we did not talk about it before. So basically, if the commercial banks such as Bank of America or Wells Fargo, if they are short of funds, if they do not have enough deposits from the customers and they have short of funds, but they want to loan out more money and basically they want to make profit, then they can basically loan funds from loan money from Fed. Fed can give loans to commercial banks. So the interest rate that the Fed charges to these commercial banks when they are giving out loans is called the discount rate. Again, commercial banks can take loans from the Fed, and when the Fed gives out loan to the commercial banks, there is an interest on that loan, and that interest rate is known as the discount rate. Okay, so how can it affect the money supply? So if the Fed decides to lower the discount rate, what does it mean? It means that the banks can take more loans now because the interest rate is lower, so they will be more keen or they will be more enthusiastic to take the loan, and that in turn means if they can take out more loans from the Fed, they have more money to loan out to people, so money supply will go up. So if Fed decreases the discount rate, the money supply will go up. On the other hand, if the Fed increases the discount rate, now the banks will be discouraged because the interest rates are high. They will not take loans from the Fed. So banks will be discouraged to take loans. They will have less funds to give out to people as loan, and as a result, money supply will decrease. Okay, so when discount rate goes up, money supply will fall, and when discount rate goes down, money supply will increase. So this is another major tool that the Fed uses to control the money supply. The final one is called the final major tool is called the open market operations. This is the one that is most commonly used. So you must remember, the most powerful one is the reserve requirement, and the most commonly used is the open market operations. What this means is the Fed engages in buying and selling securities or bonds in order to control the money supply. Okay, and this is performed by the Federal Open Market Committee. If you remember in the chapter when we talked about money, we talked about this a little bit, that the Department Federal Open Market Committee performs the buying and selling of securities and bonds in order to control the money supply. So during recession, when the economy is not doing well, such as this period, when everyone's losing jobs and there's not enough income, Fed can buy treasury securities and bonds from public and the banks. So what happens when Fed is buying the securities and bonds? Fed owns the bonds, Fed owns the securities, and in return they pay money to the banks and they pay money to the people. So when they are paying money to the banks and to the people, that means they have the banks have more money which they can loan out, people have more money in their hands, so money supply goes up. So during recession, Feds will basically buy securities, they will pay the banks and public, which in turn will increase the money supply. Now the opposite is also true. During inflation, basically the Fed will sell securities, right? They will, the securities or the bonds that they own, the Feds that they own as assets, they will sell those to the public and to the commercial banks. Now what happens when they sell them to the bank or public? The banks will start owning these assets or these securities, and in return they will have to pay money to the Fed. So what's happening? Money is going out of the banks and the people to the Fed's place. So it's going out of the economy into the Fed, so money supply is decreasing. Okay, so again, remember, if during recession, to increase money supply, Fed will buy securities. During inflation, to decrease money supply, Fed will sell securities, and this is the most common method used. Because it is a gradual process, the effect comes slowly and gradually into the economy, and that's exactly what the government and the Fed wants. Whereas the reserve requirement, that's a very powerful tool, and it's rarely used because it's so powerful and the effect is sudden and direct. It happens suddenly, and it's not something that people are expecting, so that's why it's rarely used. It's a powerful tool, but it's rarely used. You will see rarely the Fed is changing the reserve requirement because the effect on the economy is sudden, and sudden effects are not good for the economy. So although reserve requirement is the most powerful one, the most common one used is the open market operations, and reserve requirement is less used because the effect is sudden, whereas the effect of open market operations is gradual. So discount rate is somewhere in between, so they might do it, depends, it's in the middle. The effect is not too much or the effect is not too gradual. It's somewhere in the middle. Okay, now open market operations, basically the Fed buying and selling the securities. This can happen in the short term or it can happen in the long run. If it's happening in the short run, the main focus is to smoothen the interest rate. If there are fluctuations in the interest rate, they want to smooth the interest rate by buying or selling securities. Or if the goal is long term, the main reason is to control the money supply. Okay, another rate that you need to know is called the federal funds rate. That is basically the interest rate that banks charge to one another. So if Bank of America is giving loan to Wells Fargo, the interest rate charged on that loan is called the federal funds rate. Okay, so discount rate is the interest rate that Fed charges on loans given to banks, and federal funds rate is basically the interest rate that one commercial bank charges to another commercial bank when they are giving loans. So those are the major tools, and hope it clarifies what I'm trying to say. The reserve requirement, the discount rate, and the open market operations. These are the three major tools used to control the money supply. Now, just like a commercial bank, the Fed also has a balance sheet. We look when we looked at when we looked at lecture 20, commercial banks, we saw that commercial banks have balance sheets, and we also, in your homework, there was a problem to prepare a balance sheet. Same way, the Fed, or the Federal Reserve, has a balance sheet, because it is a kind of bank, but it's basically half controlled by government and half controlled by public. And probably the objective is different from commercial banks. Okay, so just like a normal bank, the Fed also has assets, liabilities, and net worth. The assets of the Fed, basically, what are the assets of the Fed? What should be listed under the assets of the Fed? These will include investments. When the Feds are buying securities, when the Feds are buying bonds from the public and from the banks, those are their assets. They are basically paying money to buy those securities. So any type of securities, any type of treasury bills, any type of treasury bonds, or treasury bonds, these are all assets for the Fed. Also, if they give loans to the banks, right, that's an asset, because the banks have to pay it back to the Fed. So that's an asset to the Fed. It is a liability for the commercial banks, but for the Fed it is an asset, because the banks have to pay it back. And the other thing, if they own any type of equipment or building, these are listed as assets for the Fed. Now, what are the liabilities of the Fed? The liabilities of the Fed are basically, if commercial banks have checking accounts with the Fed, remember, commercial banks can have checking accounts or depository accounts with the Fed. That's a liability for the Fed, because this is the bank's money they are putting with the Fed, and the Fed has to pay back. Anytime the commercial banks ask to return them this money, they will have to. Or any type of checking accounts that the government departments have, like the IRS can have checking accounts with the Fed. The Department of Homeland Security can have a checking account with the Fed, and these checking accounts for the government departments are liabilities for the Fed, because anytime those departments come and ask for the money, the Fed has to pay them back the money. Then treasury deposits, that's like IRS deposit. Another thing that's the liability for the Fed is the Federal Reserve notes outstanding. So you must remember, this is important, the Federal Reserve note is a liability for the Fed. What is the Federal Reserve notes? It's basically the paper money that the Fed issues. Remember, money is issued by Fed, right? So Federal Reserve note is basically the paper money issued by the Fed that is currently in circulation in the economy. So that is Federal Reserve, the money that they printed and that's in the circulation in the economy. That's a liability to the assets, to a liability to the Fed. Okay, and last, the net worth basically includes the investments that commercial banks make into the Fed as a corporation. So I'm just gonna do a quick example of how a balance sheet of a Fed looks like. This is important. There might be a problem in your exam about the balance sheet of the Fed. Basically, you need to know what are the items, or what items are classified under assets, what items are classified under liabilities, and net worth. Okay, but I wanted to do a balance sheet so it's clear how it looks like. Okay, so let's say this is the Fed. Again, we write the name on top, Fed, or we write the Federal Reserve Bank, and then we put the date. Let's say today's date is May 4th, 2020, and as of today, the balance sheet is given below. Again, just like a normal bank, on the right hand side, we will list the assets, and on the right hand side, on the left hand side, on the left hand side, we will list the assets of the Fed. On the top right hand side, we will list the liabilities, and at the bottom right hand side, we will list the net worth. Okay, now what are some of the assets of the Fed? Again, US Treasury bills. So US Treasury bills, and you have to write the amount also. Let's say it's 2 million. Just this number is given to you. This is, let's say it's 2 million. Then US Treasury bonds, let's say it's 459,000. Okay, then loans to bank, let's say the Fed gave loans to bank, that's an asset to the Fed, and let's say they gave 802,000. Okay, and lastly, let's say they own a building, and that's, let's say, is 1.189000. Okay, so these are the assets under a balance sheet we will list for the Fed. But remember, we always have to do a total at the bottom, because that's how the balance sheets look like. So total assets, if we all add all these numbers up, it is basically 4.45 million. Okay, so that's asset sides. Now let's look at the liability sides. What are included in the liability? So first, reserves or deposits of bank. If banks are keeping deposits, that's a liability for the Fed, and let's say they have 1.231 million, 1.231 million dollars in deposits from banks. Then let's say IRS or Treasury Department has a deposit account with them, and that is a liability for the Fed because they have to pay it back, and let's say that's 115,000. Okay, and lastly, remember Federal Reserve note, the currency in circulation, that is a liability, that is always a liability to Fed, and that, let's say that's 3 million, assuming. So that's it. Okay, so that's the liability. Then we will do a total, then we will do net worth, which is basically assets minus liabilities. This minus, if you add this up, all these up, that's equals to 104,000. And at the very bottom we will write total liabilities plus net worth, which is basically adding these three items and the net worth, which should be equal to the assets, because assets is always equals to liabilities plus net worth or equity. So it's very similar to what we did for a bank, just the items classified under each are different, and you have to think from the point of view of the Fed now instead of the bank. Okay, like US Treasury bills, they are buying these, so they own these securities, and they own, so it's like an asset to them, so it will be listed under the asset. If they are giving out loan to the banks, that's an asset to them because the banks have to pay it back to them. It's like an accounts receivable. So these have to be listed on assets. On the other hand, liabilities such as deposits of bank, if Bank of America, if let's say goes and keep money in the Fed in a deposit account, that is a liability because they have to pay back to Bank of America. Same for IRS, they have to pay the money back to IRS. And finally, Federal Reserve note is something, it's going to be always listed under liability for the Fed. So hopefully this gives you a clear idea about how the balance sheet of a Fed looks like. Very similar to a commercial bank, just the items are different. So another thing we talked a little bit last time in our last lecture is easy and tight monetary policy. Basically, when the Fed is trying to increase the money supply in the economy, they will implement easy monetary policy, and when they are trying to decrease the money supply in the economy, they will implement the tight monetary policy. So I wanted to explain a little bit more how easy monetary policy works and how it affects the economy, and same way how tight monetary policy works and how it affects the economy. So under a easy monetary policy, in order to increase the money supply, basically Fed can do any one of the three or a combination of the following based on the major tools. Remember, we learned there are three major tools: reserve requirements, discount rate, or open market operations, right? So in our easy monetary policy is when the Fed wants to increase the money supply. So in order to do so, they can do any one of the three or a combination. So they can either buy securities, treasury securities. Again, if they buy securities, they are paying money to the banks and the people, so they have more money in hands. Banks can loan out more funds to people. As a result, money supply goes up. They can reduce the reserve ratio or the required reserve ratio for the banks, so banks can loan out more funds, or they can reduce the discount rate. Basically, the loan will be cheaper for banks to take from the Fed. So these are the ways they can increase the money supply. So when they do this, when the Fed will do this, what will happen? This will increase the money supply. So let's go back to the curve. If you remember from previous classes, this is quantity, this is the inflation or price, and if you remember, this is the demand for money, which is transaction demand plus asset demand, and then the money supply was vertical because the federal or the Federal Reserve or the Fed controls the money supply and determines how much will be available in the market. So if they want to increase the money supply, easy monetary policy, if they implement those three policies, the money supply will increase. So the money supply curve will shift to the right. Okay, so this was the equilibrium interest rate before. Now what's happening to the new equilibrium interest rate? Your money supply is going up, right? So as a result, the interest rate is going down, right? It was here before, now it's coming here. So interest rate is going down. So what happens when interest rate goes down? When interest rate goes down, businesses see, oh, interest rates are down, we can take more loans now and we can make more investments. So basically, as a result of this, business investments will go up. As business investments will go up, what will happen? Businesses, when they increase investments, when they are increasing their production, they will hire more people and more people will get their income, and as a result their aggregate demand or consumption will go up. So aggregate demand will also go up. As aggregate demand go up, it creates more employment, output goes up and income goes up. So it basically directly impacts GDP. Okay, so that's how easy monetary policy works. Same way, tight monetary policy, you can decrease the money supply, or Fed can decrease the money supply by doing one of the following or a combination of the C. Fed sells treasury securities. When they are selling securities, securities are owned by the banks and people now, and in return they get money. So the money is coming from the economy to the Fed, going out of the economy, so money supply decreases. Reserve ratio can be increased. What happens? Bank will have to keep more reserve on the side so they can loan out less money to the people, so money supply decreases. Another thing is discount rate can be increased. So banks will not borrow money now because the interest rates have gone up. They will be discouraged. So once this happens, what happens is basically the money supply decreases. Again, going back to this curve, if money supply decreases, the curve will shift to the left. What happens to your interest rate now? As a result, the interest rate goes up, right? Because the money supply is going down, the interest rate is going up. The money supply curve shifts to the left and interest rate goes up. What happens when interest rate goes up? Businesses are now discouraged to take loans because the interest rate is high, and as a result business investment falls. And as business investment falls, people lose their job, aggregate demand falls, income falls, and output falls. So it directly impacts GDP. So if the economy is growing too fast compared to the income of the people, if the supply of money is growing too fast, then they will use this monetary policy, type of monetary, tight monetary policy, to achieve this goal. So that's how easy monetary policy and tight monetary policy works, and hopefully this gives you a better idea of what goes on. So now we're going to talk about the minor controls. And again, if you remember, in the beginning of the video lecture I talked about what are the three minor controls. Those are the margin requirements, the credit controls, and moral suasion. So what is margin requirement? Margin requirement is basically, it sets the minimum amount of buyers' own cash that must be invested to purchase securities. So if you're trying to buy a security, or if you're trying to buy a stock, a certain portion of money has to come from your funds. Not the entire amount cannot be a loan from the bank. Okay, so minor controls are, remember again, these are indirect effects to control the money supply. So one way they can do this is by requiring owners to bring some cash to buy stocks or securities. Okay, usually they require 50% when you're buying stocks. Okay, and it is done in order to reduce speculations. So an example, let's say if you purchase 10,000 worth of stock, then at least 5,000 must come from your own funds. You must be 5,000 from your own funds, and the remaining 5,000 you can borrow from the bank. In that way, the Fed is controlling some sort of money supply here, right? Bank is not loaning out 10,000, but instead bank is loaning out 5,000. So as a result, the money supply is controlled a little bit. So that's one way. Margin requirement is one way they can control the money supply indirectly. Now the second one is called the credit control. So basically what it means is, when you are taking a loan from the bank, they can control the interest rate, they can control the length of the time to pay back the loan, and they can also control the amount of down payment that can affect the money supply, right? Let's say 2 months back you could buy a home with only 2 to 3% down payment. Probably after 6 months down the road, they will require you to bring at least 10% down payment. So what happens is, by requiring you to bring more money, less money is supplied, right? Less money is loaned out by the banks, so money supply is controlled. So just this is an example I'm giving. If the banks can require you to bring more down payment, and the Feds can require the banks to require you to bring more down payment, that is one way they can control money supply. Or they can have banks give more loans, and then people only give 3% down payment or so. So that's one way. Another way is the time to pay back the loan. During recession, banks can have an extended period of time for the borrowers to pay back the money. On the other hand, during inflation, when the prices are going up too fast, banks can reduce this amount of time, so they can pay back the loan quickly. So that's another way they can control the money supply. The last minor tool is called the moral suasion. This is the last tool under the monetary policy, and it is a minor tool. Again, it is indirect. What it means is, basically Fed makes some suggestions that right now banks should make more loans, or right now banks should not make too much loans. They should limit the number of loans. So the Fed is like kind of like a guru to the banks, right? So as a guru, they are giving advice, or they're giving suggestions that you guys should loan out now, or you guys should not loan out now. So that it is a moral suasion. It's a kind of a suggestion, persuasion. It is not required or not mandated for the banks to follow, but it's like a guidance to them. Okay, like let's say if I tell you today, like for your exam, lecture 20 is most important, focus on chapter 20, then probably you will focus on chapter 20, right? So it's the same way. When Fed tells don't loan out more money, then banks will not probably loan out more money. Or if Fed says go ahead and loan out more money, then banks will probably go ahead and loan money. It's a suggestion they give as the someone who regulates the banks, and banks are open to accept it, or they cannot accept it. It's not mandated, basically. So these are the three minor tools. So then we look at the advantages of monetary policy and disadvantages of monetary policy. So one of the biggest advantage of monetary policy is speed and flexibility. If you remember the fiscal policy, it had to go through the Congress, Senate, and the House. For monetary policy, that's not the case. The Fed is the one implementing it. It's very quick. If they want to change the interest rate now, they can do it right away within a day. They don't have to go to Congress and President to get approval. So it's a very quick process, and it can influence the economic conditions quickly. It is also isolated from political pressure. Okay, like fiscal policy, like Republicans, they don't like taxes, they will probably lower taxes. Democrats, they like higher taxes, they will probably increase taxes. It's just their policies are motivated by their political agenda, but under the monetary policy it is not motivated by political pressure, because the Fed is a kind of independent body. It is quasi private, quasi public, and it does not have to report its daily activities to the Congress. Of course, any major activity happens, it has to answer the Congress, but it does not have to, on a day-to-day basis, the Fed does not have to report to the Congress. So that's why it's isolated from political pressure. Another advantage is called equal impact. So basically, when monetary policy is implemented, it is said that it impacts all citizens regardless of their income, or regardless of their location, or regardless of politics. So these are the advantages of monetary policy which you need to know. What are the disadvantages of monetary policy? The first one is recession. During recession, monetary policy is not very effective in controlling recession. It is very good to control inflation, but studies have shown that during recession, if you're implementing easy monetary policy, it's not very effective in controlling recession. Second, contractionary monetary policy. When you're implementing contractionary monetary policy, when you're trying to decrease the money supply, you're actually causing crowding out effect. Again, crowding out effect means you're driving out private investments, right? Interest rates are going up because money supply is decreasing. Now businesses are not interested to make investments because the interest rates are high, and it is basically driving out investments from the economy. Critics also argue that it has unequal impacts. I know we said an advantage is equal impact, but critics say, or critics of monetary policy say, that it has unequal impact. And basically what they say is interest rates, there are certain industries that are more sensitive to interest rates than others. So that's why it has unequal impact. Like the real estate or the construction industries, these are more sensitive to changes in interest rate compared to education or healthcare sectors. So that's why it says whenever there are changes in interest rates, monetary policy has unequal impact on different industries. Finally, velocity debate. What it says is the Fed has difficulty in controlling the velocity of money. So what is the velocity of money? Velocity of money is basically the number of times a dollar is spent during a year. So let's say I have $1 with me on January 1st, and then I use it to buy a Coke, and then it goes to Coke, and then Coke uses it to buy syrup, and then the syrup company uses that $1 to buy, let's say something, let's say another raw material, and this all happens in 2020. Then how many times it's how many times this dollar bill has been used in that particular year. Is it 2 times, 3 times, 4 times? How many times it exchanged hands from one person to another? That is the velocity of money, and basically that's one of the disadvantage, because Fed cannot control that. It depends on our consumption habits. It depends on people's habits on how they want to spend right? So Fed cannot control that. So that's another disadvantage of monetary policy. Monetary policy is also linked with the balance of trade, and or in other words, exports and imports. Basically, when easy money policy is implemented, when money supply is increased, it will decrease the value of dollar. The value of dollar will go down and exports will go up. On the other hand, if a tight monetary policy is implemented, then the value of dollar will go up and imports will go up and exports will go down. This is very important, the equation of exchange. This shows us the relationship between the money supply and the inflation, average price level and the inflation. So this is given by this equation: M times V is equals to P times Q, and it's known as the equation of exchange. So here M is basically the money supply, or the average amount of money in circulation. Now it can be M1 or M2 depending on the type of calculation. Remember, under money supply we have M1 and M2, so it can be M1 or M2, but we will tell which one to use. So it's the money supply. V is basically the velocity, the number of times a dollar bill exchanges hands in a year. P is the average price level in the economy, and Q is the quantity purchased. Okay, so M times V is equal to P times Q, and this is known as the equation of exchange. So I want to do an example of this, because there will be a problem like this in your MCQ or in your midterm exam, so make sure you understand this. So let me scroll down and do the example. All right, so let's say you're given with this information. You're actually given with, for the second quarter of 2008. Okay, second quarter of 2008 for US. So when I say second quarter, that means from April, May, June. So these 3 months information is given to you. Okay, so let's say M2 is given, which is the money supply. M2 is given, and it is no, the M2 in this second quarter is 7635.4 billion. Okay, that's the money supply into, that was the money supply in 2008 in the of the second quarter of that year. Okay, then P, the average price level, is, let's say, 1.22. Then Q or Y, basically that's the GDP or the output or the quantity purchase, is, let's say, 11,727.4 billion. Now given this, I ask you to calculate what is the velocity. Basically, how many times the money has exchanged hands in a particular year. So we use the formula, as you know, equation of exchange, M times V equals P times Q. We know M here, we will use M2, which is 7635.4 billion. We do not know. P we know is 1.22, and quantity we know is 11,727.4 billion. So now we rearranged each other. Okay, that will be, V will be equals to 1.22 times 11,727.4 billion divided by 7635.4 billion. Okay, now billion usually cuts off. So what we end up, if we do the calculation, we will see the answer is, or the velocity is, 1.87. Okay, and what does this mean? This means that this money supply, this is the money supply. Remember the 7635.4 billion. So this money supply, oh God, this money supply of 7634 billion, this money supply of 7635.4 billion has exchanged hands 1.87 times in the second quarter. Between April to June, this money supply has exchanged 1.87 times in the economy. Okay, now within 3 months this has happened. Now probably over 1 year it's going to be more, but that's what we get. Okay, so that's how we will calculate the velocity of money, and that is exactly what it means. This money supply has exchanged hands 1.87 times between April to June. So hopefully this gives you a clear picture of what velocity of money means and how the equation of exchange holds. Okay, now this ultimately leads us to the quantity theory of money. Quantity theory of money basically says that there is a positive relationship between money supply and price level. So basically inflation and money supply has a positive relationship. If money supply goes up, we have more inflation. If money supply goes down, inflation goes down. That's what it's trying to say, because V, the velocity, and the quantity are relatively stable during a year. And this ultimately led to the monetarist theory. Remember, we talked about monetarist theory a little bit, the control of money supply. So the quantity theory of money and the monetarist theory say that there is a positive relationship between money supply and the inflation, because the velocity and quantity, they remain relatively stable over the years. However, in response to this, Keynesians argue that no, V and Q, they don't remain stable. They actually are the V, especially the velocity of money, is very much affected by the interest rate. Interest rate can affect how you are spending money, and that makes it unstable. And as it is unstable, we cannot say that there is a positive relationship between inflation and money supply. That's the Keynesians are saying, okay? But monetary theory basically says there is a positive relationship between price level and or inflation and the money supply. So that's the end of this chapter, and that's the end of the classes for this semester. I hope you guys enjoyed my classes. Unfortunately, because of the coronavirus, we had to move to the online schedule, but hopefully the video lectures were clear enough. Again, if you have any questions, feel free to email me. If before the exams, if you have any confusions, any problems, feel free to email me. Otherwise, the exams is next week. I will open it up next week, and I will send out a separate emails with more instructions about the exam. I will send out another exam review, but for now, just go over this lecture and learn the concepts of monetary policy, how it works, and then next week we will start. We will basically take the exam. Until then, you guys have anything, you guys stay safe. If you want to take micro, let me know. I'm planning to teach it in summer and as well as in fall. So let me know, and I wish you all good luck. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure teaching you all. Feel free to email me if there is any question. Thanks. Bye.